All right. So now that we've kind of looked at it from a broader perspective, like we did on Tuesday, let's look at some different explanations that have been given to the reasons why people will act in a evil, selfish, kind of self fulfilling way. And I think it was, let's see, I want to make sure I'm on Tuesday, we kind of looked at some of the evolutionary perspectives and some of the religion and existential reasons. But the theme that seems to be consistent when it comes to answering the difference between good people and evil people really come down to what's called the dispositional approach. Okay. This is the basis of law. This is the basis of culture. This has the basis of even religion. And if you've watched a crime show or any of those, it all explains why someone does this because of what is called the disposition of the individual, the characteristics, the personality, the individual themselves. There's something within that individual that makes them do what they do. Okay. And again, this has been the basis of even in social science, from psychology to sociology and even anthropology, who studies cultures, really comes down to this idea that it's something about the person. Okay. And the question is though, why is it that we've paid so much attention to the individual who creates a crime or does a evil or one of those things? And it comes down to a few psychological processes. One, we talked about fear on Tuesday, and fear being one of our primary and probably most innate emotions. And being able to distance ourselves psychologically from someone who does something bad and us is fear reducing. Okay. And this process is caused between something known as cognitive dissonance. Okay. Cognitive dissonance is when you come across a behavior that is counter to your attitudes, beliefs, and ideas of the world. Okay. So the ways we reduce cognitive dissonance, though, is that it creates kind of that psychological tension, that anxiety is, could I be that person who could stab another human being or shoot another human being? And that creates dissonance in most of us, I hope. Okay. And so, what do we need to do that? We need to reduce that dissonance by making a difference between someone who would shoot or stab someone and me. So, we make something about the characteristics of that individual that makes them separate from I. And sometimes on a global level or on a societal level, different than us. And that reduces our anxiety and our stress, that because I'm not like them, I would not engage in that behavior. Okay. Um, and this comes down to kind of a universal, um, what's known as attribution error. In fact, it's so universal, it's actually called the fundamental attribution error. Okay. When we don't really think and we're just processing information on the whim and kind of automatically, and we don't step back and really evaluate something, is when we're most likely to make this fundamental attribution error. And it goes something like this. When I succeed, it's because of me. It's my disposition. Okay, so let's say I get an A on a test. Well, dang it, it's because I study hard, I'm smart, I'm awesome, okay? But things that I fell at, I tend to make an external attribution. So I fell a test. Well, it's because the test was unfair. They told me the wrong information to study. That professor has it out for me. Okay. Now, that's kind of, and again, if you think about that, that kind of protects our quote unquote ego. It makes us kind of feel okay about things. The problem with that is we kind of do the difference when we automatically think about other people. So, for example, when we see someone else when someone else does passes an exam, we think, well, they were lucky. Their exam must have been easier than mine. The teacher likes them. Um, we give some type of external attribution. Okay. That person got the promotion because, the boss likes them more than me. It's not because of them that they're successful. It's because of things that they're lucky. It's called the lucky kind of attribution. Now, though, when other people fail, we make internal attributions to them. So when someone else's fails the exam, we go, wow, they didn't study hard enough. They're not committed to their school. Um, they showed up late. They chose not to wait till the last minute to study. We make some type of disposition about them. Okay. Now, again, you're probably going, well, I don't do that with everyone, but I'd be willing to bet that everyone you don't do that to is because you have a deep relationship with them and you think about them in a slower way. You think of them on a conscious level. The fundamental attribution is an automatic process. Okay. So this also brings up the external influences. Okay. That some people who are evil because they're drugs, alcohol, bad parents, possessions by evil spirit, all of these things that obviously I don't have to worry about. Okay. And those are then used to also kind of justify a different crime. Now, this cognitive dissonance approach also explains why we often blame victims for something that happens to them. Okay. Um, bel Believe it or not, there was research came out 2025. They did a survey about, reasons someone got sexually assaulted. Okay. And it was interesting because there was a gender difference. Both genders did some type of victim blaming, okay? Meaning that, well, it was because she was at the wrong place, wrong time, she shouldn't. But what was interesting is the gender difference is the women were much more harsh in their victim blaming. So they would say things like, well, she must be, excuse me if you have kids around, but this was something that was actually in the research, very common. Well, she must be just a slut and she wanted it. Those were more common statements by women than they were by men. Okay. Now, before you start thinking, well, that's awful, I want you to think about how psychologically safe that makes a female when females are raped more often than men, and it's portrayed in the media much more than when a man is. Okay. If you think about that, if it's the disposition of that victim is the reason she got assaulted, then that makes me safe because I'm not like her. So I can go to that same bar, and because I'm not her, I won't get raped. I can dress how I want to dress, but because I didn't dress like her, I won't be raped. And so making it about the choices that an individual made because of the disposition, their personality and characteristic traits, is a psychological cushion that makes us feel better, at least on a subconscious or unconscious level, that I won't be them. Okay. Because if we give it up to the situation and we say there was a situational forces or it was because of the offender, well, I know a lot of people like that dude. But dudes like that aren't going to harm me because I'm not like her. Okay. See how that creates that psychological distance. Okay. So not only do we give dispositional qualities to people who commit acts of evil, we give dispositional qualities to people who are the recipients or the victims of awful criminal acts. Okay. And even, and again, we can take this on a global level. Um, there, after World War II, and we found the atrocities of what happened to Jews and gay men and gypsies and all of the individuals, war crimes, Russians, American, and a few Americans in the mix in there. Um, it wasn't immediate that people went, Jews were victimized innocently. Okay, most people who were surveyed would say something like that should have never happened to them, but it happened to them because they are like X, Y, and Z. If they didn't behave that way, they would have never ended up in those concentration camps and where they were at. So again, creating that psychologically safe barrier, they're victims, but they brought it upon themselves, is one of those common psychological barriers that we create ourselves. And if you think about it, in some ways, it makes sense because it makes us feel safe and makes us feel okay. So let's look at some of the ideas behind this. Okay. First is what's known as the mental health hypothesis. And you could probably see that every time we have a mass shooting or a horrible criminal crime, everyone starts, doing the prayers and stuff. But they say we got to increase services to mental health. We've got to increase counseling and addiction services and all these things. We don't do it. We just say it until everyone forgets. Um, and so this idea that it's mental illness is what drives people to do evil acts. Okay. So the question becomes is how accurate is this hypothesis? Okay. While one, it is true that in the prison system here in the United States, many people who end up in jail are of low income and homeless populations, and they do tend to suffer from mental health issues. Okay. So you can see that if you take the pure numbers of people put in prison and say, look, there's all these people in these jails and prisons that have mental health issues that are doing crime. And so, therefore, it must be a mental illness that drives that, not normal people. Okay. But let's take a closer look at that based on history. Okay. So, in the 1800s, we established mental health hospitals and inpatient centers. Now, I'm not going to say near the 1950s and 1960s there needed to be reform in that because we were doing some pretty awful things to people near the end of the mental institution era. But mental health hospitals and inpatients grew in popularity and they grew until the 1950s, 60s. And then in the 1960s, um, uh, uh, John F. Kennedy signed I think it's a community health thing, where what he basically said is that mentally ill people are better treated in their community than they are by an institution. So he deinstitutionalized mental illness, which then flooded communities with homeless, mentally ill individuals. Okay. Now, the interesting thing in this is if you look at before and after um, um, uh, deinstitutionalization, did we see a huge increase in crime? Did we see a huge increase in the prison population? The answer is yes, we did, but it was the product of the 60s and 70s and the civil rights movements and all those kinds of things. The thing is so if you control for that, okay, and you control for things that would be considered crimes that are committed post the movements in the 60s and 70s, okay? So if you control for that, prison before deinstitutionalization didn't have a mental health issue. There were very few prisoners with mental health issues. But after deinstitutionalization and the criminalization of poverty, all of a sudden prisons get full of individuals with mental illness, and it exceeds the population of people that don't. Okay. So the question becomes, is it mental illness or is it poverty and homelessness and how we treat institutions that create crime, not necessarily the people we put into those situations? And that's the question. But because of that, there became a mindset that mentally ill people are dangerous and we need to criminalize it in some way. Okay. But what are the facts? Well, some facts is that let's say you wanted to live somewhere where you reduce your probability, at least statistically, of not being physically assaulted by someone. Okay. I would recommend going and living in a secure, healthy, assisted living place for people with schizophrenia. Okay. Because that's actually the safest place to be, because statistically, you're about twice as probable of being hit and slapped or physically assaulted by your neighbor than you are living in a community of individuals with schizophrenia. Okay? Something to think about. Think about depression and anxiety. A depressed person does not have the motivation to harm another person. That would be too much for their disorder. A person with anxiety, they would worry too much about what and how and when, and their minds would become overloaded and wouldn't be able to follow through with it. So the issue with the mental health hypothesis is if you look at the mental illnesses, most mental illnesses drive individuals towards withdrawing from the world, not aggressing towards the world. So it has its issues. Okay. Now we should talk about the difference between mental health and mental illness. Okay. Mental health is whether you have the sufficient psychological, biological, and social supports in your world to be okay. Mental illness is when those systems are hijacked and you really don't have a lot of control unless you do something, medication, treatment, and all of those things to help overcome it. So people with mental health issues, we can say, yeah, a person, if we look at most school shootings, it usually narrows down to a poor social support system, glorification of events of mass murdering, and rejection. Those three combinations seem to set up the triad that would cause that. Not a mental illness, not drugs, not alcohol, not a personality. Um, so yes, mental health. If we look at that from that perspective, mental illness, it gets a little bit more rocky. Okay. So that's where it is with the mental health hypothesis and why it's called a hypothesis and not a theory, because it's still something that test wise can't prove either way or not. Okay. What about the self-esteem hypothesis? Okay. The self-esteem hypothesis suggests that individuals engage in deviant behavior do so because they have a low sense of self-esteem. And this was kind of some of the original theories behind bullying, and then it became one of the major theories behind domestic violence and relationship violence, is that in both of those cases, in the bullying and the domestic violence case, you start with a person who has a very low self-esteem, low self-worth. They think horribly about themselves. And so, in order to gain power and control, they hurt physically, emotionally, and psychologically someone close to them, and that their low self-esteem, and that pushes that person's self-esteem down and makes them feel better about themselves. Okay. And so, yes, in our prison systems, in early versions of what they called batter's treatment, most of the treatment that they did was first um, helping raise the inmates or the domestic abuser's self-esteem. Because the idea is if you lift their self-esteem, they'll they'll no longer be driven to abuse their partner. The problem is there's two. One is if you measure self-esteem among both bullies and among domestic abusers, they often have an inflated self-esteem. They tend to think very well of themselves. And the other thing that we found is that increasing self-esteem among these populations increases danger within the home. Because now, if you've taken someone, let's say a domestic abuser that did have low self-esteem or moderate self-esteem, and now they think much better of themselves, they're much more confident into the reason why they abuse or why they bully. They feel even more justified in the act itself. Okay. So the self-esteem hypothesis has been kind of abandoned. There's a few anger management programs and stuff out there that still promote it a little bit, but it largely by today has been abandoned as a solution for bullying or a solution for relationship violence. But it's still one that is often out there in popular culture. We already talked about religion on Tuesday. Um, I do want to talk a little bit about that dude named Freud, and how he relates into sociology. If you take in Psychology 101, Freud was that guy who believed that human beings are driven by two unconscious primary drives. Okay. If you have a kid in the room in the Zoom, plug their ears real quick. The first primary drive we all have is sex. The second primary drive we have is aggression. And these two drives are trying to be satisfied by any means. And so then we have what he called the ego, that kind of is that thing that is the mediator and says, well, you know, you can't walk into that room and have sex with everyone, but you can walk in that room and act a certain way that might increase your probability of being able to do that later. That's kind of what the ego or Freudian idea is. Well, during World War I and World War II, There was another famous person that was kind of curious about all this violence, World War One, and then getting into World War Two. And his name was Albert Einstein, this famous mind of physics. And he was baffled by the nature of evil that was going on with world wars and all of these things. And so he wrote a letter to Freud and asked Freud, why is it that humans tend to always be in some type of conflict, some type of um, um, war? Okay. And Freud simply wrote back and said, because we live in civilization and we're discontent with it. Okay. And what did he mean by that? Um, One of Freud's kind of idea is that one of our basic drives are two counterintuitive drives. One aims towards life, one aims towards destruction. And those are two very conflictual and chaotic things. Okay. And humans, on some level, know their nature. And so we build civilizations to make sure that those natural, innate drives are controlled. Okay. But as a group, when we become discontent with that, when we see other people who might not see it the way we do, or we may want to take advantage of, we then aggress with them. Okay. Now, what Freud did and what another philosopher did in the United States is really it's a justification for our legal, social, and cultural government rule. The basis of government based based on Freudian theory and I can't remember his name, some other dude's name. I'll remember later. Is that people in their nature are chaotic, aggressive. We're selfish. We want to take advantage of everyone else. And therefore, we need to establish institutions to control those populations so that we just don't go extinct. Okay. And so this is the basis for things like why we have governments, because we by ourselves are uncontrollable. We need the government to tell us how to behave and how to act. Okay. So this then creates what leads to what is known as a personality of evil. Okay. So if we have our good government and our good society and it controls the majority of people, it makes us so my natural aggressive tendencies. I'm not beating up the three students here in class. And I think they do that. I would lose. But on that, because of the government, thank goodness the government made it so I have laws and rules that say I can't do that, right? Thank you, government. I'm a good person because of you. But what about people who go against the government? Well, it must be because they have a disposition, a personality that they don't possess what all of us good law-abiding citizens have. Okay, there's something unique about them, and so this is kind of then goes into um, let me get to this into, for example, the forensic psychology approach to understanding things like criminal behavior. Okay. So if you're one of the forensic psychology people, what is that primary approach to understanding the criminal? Okay. Well, in forensic psychology, the goal is to understand uh, the predictor variables that cause a person to commit a crime. Okay. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the crime scene. We're going to interview victims. we're going to look at evidence, and we're going to look at if we catch the person, we're going to do psychological profiles and all of these, and we're going to come up with a profile of someone, which then predicts when a future crime could be committed if those variables are in place. Okay. And what this hopes to do, in some sense, is that another crime occurs somewhere else, you can go look at, well, this is the tools they use. This is, the way they did it. You're looking for this type of person. Okay. Um, Now, I do want to just make it clear that forensic psychology does not attempt to understand evil. Okay. So they can't say why, you know, I don't know, Ted Bundy preferred women blonde with hair splitted down the center um, uh, at a certain build. Okay. They can't explain why that feature caused Bundy to do that, but they did note that, but if you see similarities in victims, that tends to tell you something about who you should be profiling. Okay. So they can't say why Bundy preferred that type, but they can say, based on that, if you see similar features and similar body size among victims, that tells you something about the type of killer that you're looking for. Okay. So forensic psychology is kind of a leaf off of that end where what we wanted to do is look at the situation and the way it was done, the tools that were done, and let's see if we then can predict in the future whether someone will do that or not. Okay. And then we do have, the modern genetic science. So this is kind of in this sense to identify how much evil is determined by hereditary versus environmental forces. And the thing that I would say about the genetics is that we can find some clear lines for some uh, uh, people where they are both biologically and environmentally connected to individuals in the past. In fact, one of the famous psychologists who studied psychopathic serial killers years scanning brains, looking at brain tissue, dissecting offenders after they passed, um, started to notice a genetic line that there tends to be an association with past individuals who also did that. The issue is, though, is him doing his own genetic history. He found that within his immediate three generations, three or four serial killers that were genetically connected to him. Okay. So the question becomes, does genetics really determine the psychopath, even when there's clear genetic lines? Or does the environment, because here we have a human being who is spent his entire life trying to figure out the psychopath, the biology, the neurology, the genetics, and he himself have those similar genetic traits and genetic past. So the point of this story is where are we in the genetics of things like psychopathology and those kinds of things. We're about the same place where we are with how much your personality is determined by biology or environment. It's somewhere between 10% to 60%, depending upon the study you read. So genetics does an okay job. Now, of course, genetics comes in handy when investigating crime, but does genetics tell us whether a person would commit a crime or not? Depends on the research you read. So that's where genetics is right now. All right. This is a question I'm going to leave you for the weekend. Think about this. Go get your favorite animal, your favorite pet. And on Tuesday, I want you to come back and tell me if you would strap him in something that would shock him with 450 volts of electricity. Enough just to shock that little shit to death and maybe see some burning fur. Okay? That's the question I want you to ponder for the weekend. I told you I could get weird. All right. That is a question for the weekend. Is there any questions here in class?